Thanks.
Reframing portraits of philanthropy. That was my big idea 6 years ago. I work in the field of philanthropy as a writer and project strategist, and for some time I've been unsettled by prevailing stories and images around philanthropy and who's qualified to be a philanthropist. The conventional frame is narrowly set, and as a result for me is somewhat distorted. It's a familiar frame. It seems to center only on the money and how many zeros are in the check, how much media coverage the press release gets, and whether you get a car and you get a car and you get a car. But I know a different story. And my story around philanthropy is centered around the root meaning of the word, its translation from Greek. Love of humankind, love of humanity. And as is often the case, when love enters the picture, everything changes. And that shift occurred for me. Suddenly, philanthropy had a far wider frame, a more inclusive and colorful frame that included stories of giving of time, talent, and treasure, stories that centered on people who gave not to elevate themselves, but instead to liberate others. Stories that included African Americans as benefactors instead of only as the beneficiaries, which is not insignificant given that African Americans give nearly 9% of our disposable income to philanthropic causes, more than any other racial group in America. It included the story of my great Aunt Dora. And I remember it like it was yesterday when my mom called and told me that Aunt Dora had begun serving free meals in a public housing project in Asheboro, North Carolina. And I thought, what is she doing? I mean, Aunt Dora is 70-some years old. She's approaching retirement. She's been a giver and doer and had a life of service. Isn't it time for her to scale back? I mean, she'd been a giver as a mother, a foster mother, a den mother, a grandmother, a spiritual mother, as the pastor of a church, and she was right at retirement. Why was she taking this on? And it was only later that I learned that in preparation for her retirement, Aunt Dora intentionally took time out for a silent retreat. She was seeking the answer to her question, what next? And for her, the answer was, feed the hungry. So she founded Our Daily Bread Soup Kitchen, which 20 years later is still in operation. She continues to pour her monthly Social Security check into its operations. She has invested in a new, bigger facility to serve more families. And at 92 years old, she continues to cook and serve and provide leadership to the nonprofit. And so it's through Aunt Dora's story that I knew the true meaning of philanthropy and was inspired to write a book. I wanted to illuminate stories of everyday givers and unsung philanthropists like Aunt Dora. And when the idea for the book landed on me, the picture was so clear what the book would look like. In fact, her hands graced the cover of the book, and how the vignette stories would read, and the artful photography that would fill each page, and how readers would respond to the book and be inspired to become givers themselves. But what I didn't know is that it would take so long to go from conceiving of an idea to actually birthing the book. It took 4.5 years, or as I think of it, 1,621 days. I think of it in days because from the moment the idea landed on me, Every 24 hours, I woke up with ideas about how to reframe philanthropy raging in my head. And every night, I went to bed and dreamt about it.
When I was growing up, I didn't plan on being a photographer. But I knew I'd have to break frames in order to be here with you today. I was born a statistic. Black male, single mom, absent father. You know the frame. Uneducated, poor, prison, jail. But my mom said that I can be anything I wanted. And I believed her. I believed that I was special. I believed that I was special because I got free and reduced lunch when I went to school. I believed I was special because when I took field trips, teachers would give me money. It was cool. But I did struggle. Named after my father, I hated him and I hated my name, Charles William Thomas Jr. And then in the 7th grade, my reality became further distorted because I sounded white. Because I was the only black kid in an honors history class when we were talking about slavery. Or because I was in a classroom during the African famines, and I saw images of malnourished children. And those images made me realize that because I got free and reduced lunch, that didn't mark me as special. That meant that I was poor. So I struggled with this identity in middle school and high school and college until I found, or better yet, embraced photography. And I was challenged by an assignment. Create a self-portrait of you and your father. How do you create an image of someone that you've never met before? It's never been in your life. And I was taken by this concept, and I had to reframe my relationship with my dad. And in the process, I discovered the meaning of my name. Charles, strong man. William, protector. Thomas, the quest for truth. Photography hooked me, and I decided to start my own photography business, Sankofa Photography. My mission, reframe images of black men. Challenge conventional notions of what it means to be black in America. So I quit my corporate day job, and I started this business. Years later, as a photographer, Valaida approached me several years later. And at that time, I was a father, 3 boys, and I was at a crossroads. I was about to put my camera on the shelf and kind of put my ideals aside. For any of you who are artists, you understand, trying to make that money. But Valaida approached me with giving back, and I knew that this fit in with my mission, and I knew that this would allow me to be what I always wanted.
When you reframe something, you must first deconstruct what was once there. And that can be excruciating when that something is you. I remember it like yesterday when I approached Charles about the book project. And the entire time I spoke, he held this bemused look on his face. And to this day, I'm not quite sure what to attribute the smirk to. I don't know if he was thinking, wow, this woman is so animated and excited as she talks about this project. Or maybe he took note of the fact that I'd been thinking about it for a while and had every single detail laid out as to how we would execute this project. Or maybe Charles knew that it would take far more than 9 months or a year, as I once thought, to complete the project, and that in fact it would be more like 1,621 days. But what Charles didn't know was my own struggle with my identity as a writer. Despite the fact that for the last 14 years I've worked as a writer on a range of projects for a host of clients, and despite the fact that I was embarking on this really ambitious book project that would require me to write a whole lot, nevertheless, I was still uncomfortable with the label writer. For me, the frame for a writer is somebody with an English degree or a journalism major, neither of which is the case for me. Nevertheless, I jumped into the project, and it was only about halfway through that the doubts began to swarm with stinging questions about whether I had what it took to see this ambitious project through, whether I could raise the $200,000 required to fulfill the project I envisioned, whether I could convince 200 black donors to share their stories with me and to sit for portraits with Charles, and whether I had the wherewithal to craft compelling stories and give due reverence to the ancestors and elders and the African American community that I wanted to pay tribute to. And there were days that brought me to my knees and to the brink of existential crisis as I questioned who I was, what I was trying to be, what really mattered. And in essence, it tore me down. And it was only through Charles's generosity and collaborative spirit and through a circle of family and friends who oftentimes had more confidence in me than I had in myself that I was able to see the project through. And after 4.5 years, get the book published. And once the book was published and I saw it and it satisfied every dream and hope and wish that I had, and we've been fortunate enough to receive some awards and readers have responded in the way I hoped, the picture is very clear today. I am a writer.
So I had no idea that the project would take 4 years or 1,000+ days when Valaida approached me. And I had no idea that Valaida was struggling with the project. For me, the project was a steady journey of partnership and collaboration and incubation. But along the way, there were a few surprises, and one which really stuck with me. And the big one is the stories that were not told. There were so many people that were unable to embrace the idea of being a philanthropist. The idea was too big. They thought that what they gave or did was insignificant, or they were humble, and they didn't want to share their story. And that's unfortunate, because it's our stories and the gifts that we have that our society needs. And if we don't share those stories, then it leaves our community with a deficit. And I believe it also leaves a hole in the fabric of inspiration, because it's from these stories that we are inspired to do great things. One story sticks with me in particular, and that's the story of Bob Brown, 19-year-old park and rec counselor who tutored and mentored young men in his community, went on to college, graduated, and became one of the first African-American FBI agents in the US. He left the agency and moved back to High Point, North Carolina to start a marketing firm in the 1960s. A marketing firm run by a black man in the 1960s. So in spite of the conditions, in spite of the challenges and the doubts, Mr. Brown went on to grow a successful business. And along the way, he continued to give. What started out with smiles and kindness and warm words became thousands of dollars that he gave to help young people go to college. The interesting thing is, those small words that he gave as a park and rec counselor made the difference in a few young men's lives that went on to become doctors and presidents of universities today. And so it's from the stories of Bob Brown and many of the stories that are in the book that I've reframed how I think about philanthropy and giving, collective giving. Philanthropy is the love of humankind, but it's the idea of also giving a hand up versus a hand out. And it inspires the work that I do today, which is with social entrepreneurship, where we're reframing how we do business as usual, where we reframe how we look at marginalized communities and people and individuals, the homeless, the poor, the formerly incarcerated, and stop thinking about them as deficits and think of them as assets.
So you're looking at a writer who almost wasn't, and a photographer and social entrepreneur that almost wasn't, an award-winning book that almost wasn't. We've painted pictures of a variety of things that nearly never existed. And I've learned that setting a rigid frame, whether it's about an idea or an identity or an issue, can be limiting. And so I choose to keep my imagination and my mind as pliable and supple as possible. And I suppose this is a lesson that my Aunt Dora learned somewhere along her 92-year journey, which, by the way, translates into 34,000 days and dwarfs my 1,600-day experience recently. But she learned the power of a picture reframed. As my Aunt Dora evolved from a stay-at-home mom to heading to divinity school in her 50s to embracing her philanthropic spirit at 70 to today, serving as an inspiration by having shared her story and her hands that grace the cover of the book now that she's 92 years old.
So what story are you not sharing? What part of you are you not embracing? What frame are you locked into? Thank you.